Hey all, so if you have been around here for a while, you know I talk about networking all the time and why it is the key to your job search. And so today though, I wanted you to hear it from somebody other than me. I feel like you hear me say it all the time, but I wanted you to hear it from somebody who's done it, who put in the work networking, and she went from full-time job seeker to full-time employed. And so I present to you my conversation with Randa Hinton. First off, just for the sake of my audience, I probably already introduced you on my own, but just in case, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Randa Hinton, and I am a former COVID job seeker, and recently got my full-time job.
Yay, that's awesome. First off, I just want to know, first tell us what your job is. The job that you got, what are you doing now?
So I broke out of nonprofit and landed at a corporate company. I am now working, it's a computer graphics company, so kind of more in the tech space. And I'm doing marketing for their cloud service providers. So doing marketing, communications. There's about 100 partners that I will be directly responsible for in the future. And so I'm helping kind of build that program up. And I'm super excited about it. It's kind of like a dream job.
Nice. And so let's go back to March because you
Mhm.
are a recent grad. We'll talk about that. Like you're a recent grad. Let's go back to like March 7th, pre
Yeah.
the world blowing up. What did you think your job search would look like?
I thought that I would have a job by the beginning of May before graduation. Like I had this whole plan. My mom and sisters had surprised me with like a 3-week trek around Europe after graduation. So I was like freaking out, like, oh, I'll have to tell my job that I'll be gone for 3 weeks because I'm going to Europe. So I was very like, happy about the job search. Like, oh, it'll be great. I'll land this job in May and then I'll go to Europe and then I'll come back and it'll all be
Mm. And then tell everyone, just so everyone knows where you're at, like what were you getting your degree in? You were at the end. What was that?
Yeah. So I was at USC. I was finishing a master's in communication management where I was focusing on corporate comms and marketing. So I had gone to undergrad, did 5 years of work in between, and knew that I wanted to pivot into corporate because my work before had been in the nonprofit space. So I knew I wanted to kind of transition, which is why I went to get a master's and ended up at USC and loved the program.
Nice. Just for everyone watching, I'd like the record to show she worked in between. If you haven't watched my video on should you go to grad school, she worked in between as you're supposed
Yeah.
to. So watch that video if you haven't. So what did your job search end up looking like?
Oh my gosh. I would say so February I had wrapped up a big client because I was also freelancing while in grad school. And in my head, I was like, okay, I'll take 2 weeks off and then I'll start my job search. Like beginning of March, that's when I'll hit the ground running. And so once we kind of heard what the pandemic was, we're like, okay, we'll all be, in our houses for 2 weeks. It'll be great. We'll, tackle our home projects that we've been putting off. And so I was prepared for those 2 weeks. And then I started to slowly get a few interviews at the beginning of the pandemic. And then once people realized, oh, this is a long-term thing, everything went on hold. So companies that I'd been interviewing with either didn't end up calling me back or saying, oh, we can no longer move forward with this position. Everything's on a hiring freeze. So from about April to, I would say, the end of May, there were no interviews. So there was 2 months of just silence. And then June, it started picking up again, but that's because I put some very intentional strategies around my job search. So June, it started picking up again. And in August was when I got the offer.
Nice. So let's talk about those strategies. What did you
Mhm.
do in April and May?
Okay, so I was watching the movie The Book Club, and it's a really funny movie. I highly recommend it. But it was like, like in the early stages of the pandemic, and they were one of the ladies does online dating, and I was like, oh my god, like I should try online dating. So I signed up for all of the websites at like 2 o'clock in the morning,
Okay.
and during that time, I was like, oh, I should start a podcast about job searching. Like this all came together while watching this movie at 2 o'clock in the morning. There was no like planning. I was like, I'm going to start a podcast. I texted a friend who was in the same program as me and was like, hey, do you want to start a podcast? And she said yes. So from like, I think that was April and May, we just, kind of casually started talking about it. And then June 1st, we launched. It's called Opportunity Unknown. And we decided to tell our story as job seekers trying to find a job during the pandemic. So creating a podcast forced me to create content. So I was like, oh my gosh, like, what are we going to talk about during the week? Which meant I had to redo my resume, redo my cover letters. I started hardcore networking, which is something I'm very passionate about and had been before the pandemic. But I think because of the pandemic, I understand it way more and how important it is. And so that really like forced me to kind of rework some of those strategies. So I did information interviews like crazy. So I just started reaching out to people on LinkedIn who were either in my network or who weren't in my network, and just really started asking people to tell me their stories, which ended up being great because I got a lot of encouragement, but I also just ended up making some really cool connections, and through that got interviews.
Nice. And so let's break those two things down, because I have talked in other videos on my channel about there are two types of networking. There's outbound networking, which is what we all traditionally think of reaching out to people, but there's also inbound networking where people come to you. So let's start with outbound first, because I think that's what people are more familiar with. And then we'll talk about the podcast, because I have thoughts, and I'm very impressed by the podcast. Y'all, spoiler, I've been a guest.
Yes.
But they've done such a good job with it, and we'll talk about that. But first, outbound. So reaching out to people. You said you reached out to people in your network, out of your network. What did that sort of look like?
Yeah, so I decided I wanted to go into tech. And early on, I was thinking, I'm in LA, like I'm in the entertainment capital of the world, so that's where my first job will be. But quickly realized they were not hiring. So I had to pivot my focus, and I started looking at tech, healthcare, and energy. Those were the industries that for comms and marketing, they were still hiring. So that's kind of where I shifted my focus. So I went on LinkedIn and I started using the alumni tool. And if you don't know about that, it's an amazing feature that LinkedIn has. And I started looking at people that went to where I went to, both undergrad and grad school, who are in roles that I either would like to have in the future or would like to have now. And I just started messaging them, and I just said something along the lines of, hey, I'm Randa. I just graduated from USC. I'm looking to get into corporate communications. I'd love to hear your story and how you got there. Would you be open to 15 to 20 minutes of chatting with me? And that's how I started. Now, just to be really honest, at the beginning of this, I did say, hey, I'm Randa, looking for a job. Do you know of anything? And I said that to people like who I didn't know, and I do not do that. No one responds to that. And so I had about 10 different drafts of my informational interview, like kind of question that I sent out with my LinkedIn connections before I really kind of perfected one that worked for me. And that was one that really started getting me people who would say yes and were willing to talk to me. But yeah, I started adding people on LinkedIn, and anytime you add someone, please include a note. That's something I'm very passionate about too, because people want to know why you want to connect with them. And it's not anything like crazy, just like, hey, I'd love to hear your story, or hey, I saw you did something interesting, I'd love to follow you. So I started doing that, and I did a total of 150 informational interviews between
Did you
April
hear that?
And
just want to make sure everyone heard that. 150. It's a lot.
Yes.
But let's remember though, if you keep up with those people, as you should, because we always talk about networking is relationship building. It's not using someone for a job and then being like, peace out. Those people are going to help you get the next job and the next job, or the jump, or they're going to become your friends, or they're going to help they're going to be the people you cry to on a bad day, or can vent about industry stuff that family doesn't understand. Like, I want people to understand that 150 to get the one job isn't just for the one job.
Yeah.
It's going to take you other places. Thank you for being honest that in the beginning you're like, oh, I'm looking for a job. This is how I think of that. That would be like walking up to somebody at a party and being like, hi, my name's Cassandra. Do you want to go on a date? Like, no, who are you? Why would I say yes to that? Like, no, really, it's almost, I mean, you're asking for a job. It's almost like saying, do you want to get married? Like, let's commit to each other. We don't know each other. So you have to give a little bit of that, like, hey, I want to hear about you. And I love that you said, like, I want to hear your story. People, y'all, the two things I say about this are people love to talk about themselves and people love to give advice. And so they're going to be receptive. Now, I want to know, how did you deal? I think what scares a lot of people from starting networking, starting informational interviews is, what if they don't respond? What if
Yeah.
they say no? Like, how did you handle that?
Yeah. So I said that I did 150 informational interviews, and those were just people that said yes. So I haven't even counted the amount of people that I reached out to. So I think one thing to note is that not everybody's on LinkedIn the way that you are as a job seeker. So you
Mhm.
may have sent a request a month ago, and like this happened with me. I would send a request, and 2 months later, somebody would be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I just saw this. I haven't been on my LinkedIn." Or somebody would say, "Oh my gosh, I meant to respond to this a week ago, but totally forgot." So one of the things I realized was it's really okay to follow up. So after about a week, if you don't get a response, just politely follow up, and then maybe try a month later. But then after that, maybe let that go, and that's
Mhm.
okay too. Not everybody's going to respond. But I think one of the things I realized, like people were busy. Like there were some women specifically that I'd reached out to who were going on maternity leave, and they would say, "Hey, Randa, like I'm so sorry. I'm really busy right now. Feel free to send me an email." So things like that. So there are no's along the way, but I think for me, I just kind of had this sense of urgency. I knew what the
Mhm.
world was doing. And I also like remember the 2009 recession. So I'm like, there's just a lot of weight that was with me on this. And like, I had very strategic goals for myself. So I just was like, you know what? I'm going to put my entire life into networking. And I exhausted myself, if I can be completely honest.
Yeah, let's talk about
But
that.
I think ultimately it ended up working out, but I did exhaust myself in that.
So I remember when I was on your podcast, you asked about
Hmm.
that of like, well, how do you manage the people? And I'm like, well, quit
Yeah.
reaching 50 people a day. How about we like space it out? And this is the thing, I think I've done it before with work related things. Like I have to connect with employers in my job, and I would reach out to even 10. Like I would reach out to 10 employers in one day. And then when 9 would get back to me, I'm like, oh crap, I don't have time to
Mhm.
do 9 phone calls right now. So we all do some version of it. But can you talk about like how you started off and then what happened after? Like, did you change
Yeah.
anything after burning out, or
Yeah, I
how'd that
think
go?
there was like 2 weeks where I just stopped reaching out because I was exhausted. And also, I think just want to be very candid and like being a job seeker takes a toll on your mental health. And so I needed to just take some space to just rest. But there was one day in particular, I remember I had 6 informational interviews on the same day. And Annika, my co-host, was like, "Randa, you're crazy. Like, this is you. Like, how are you doing this?" And that was like the day when I realized you're doing too much. Because not only did I have 6 informational interviews, I had to share my story 6 times, hear a story 6 times, and then follow up with 6 people. And that was just a lot in the midst of sending out resumes, working on a podcast, like all of these things that I ended up having to do. So I really had to tell myself, you cannot manage this amount of relationships. And granted, I would say out of my 150 interviews, there are about 20 or 30 that have become very strategic.
Hmm.
Like one of the women that I did an informational interview with, like her company wasn't hiring, but she walked me through negotiations with my current job. So we met, and she
Awesome.
was the first person who told me her actual salary, like from starting to where she was now. And she was like, "Have you done this? Have you done this?" And so when I was being considered for an offer, I reached out to her and I was like, "Hey, before I make a mistake, can I talk to you about this?" And so just had very strategic relationships that were built. And like on the podcast side, I met with a producer. And so that was just really cool because he, like, has given some advice for us on our podcast.
Hmm. That's awesome. And I love that she shared her salary. Like that's something
Yeah.
people don't realize. Once you get close with people, they're not always going to offer it, but like if you ask, they'll at
Yeah.
least give you everyone might not share the exact number, but they'll give you a ballpark, or they'll say,
Yeah.
well, I'm in this range, but entry right now, I know we're hiring at this level. Like that's why networking is more than just get the job. That's why I love informational interviews, because you gather information on things that you didn't even,
Yeah.
you don't know what you don't know until somebody says it and you
Exactly.
go, oh my gosh, I needed to know that. Like it can be money, it can be classes you should take,
Hmm.
certifications you need. Like there's so much out there. So what did, other than taking the 2 weeks off, did you
Yeah.
change your strategy in some way?
Yeah, I just started being more intentional with the people that I was reaching out to. So I stopped reaching out to people that were at companies that weren't hiring, which for me was a big deal. Like at the time I knew I really wanted to work for Disney. And like that had kind of always been on like my dream list, but unfortunately we all kind of know what's happening with Disney right now and like the
Right.
crazy amount of layoffs that they've had to do. So I had to stop reaching out to companies that weren't in the industries that I was in, not because it was bad. And yes, those relationships might be able to help me one day in the future, but I knew that I had a timeline for when I needed a job. So I
Right.
just started making more strategic picks about the companies that I was looking at, and just started doing a little bit more follow up in that. So if I talked to somebody about a month ago, I would reach out again and just say, hey, like something like, I saw this cool article. It made me think about the conversation we had when we talked. Hope you're doing well. So I just started, not doing as many like interviews, but a little bit more of on the follow up side.
Nice. Is it weird that I'm like trying so hard not to smile a ton because I just get so excited when I hear people like doing the right things. Like, yes, you did. Yes. Follow up. It's not a one and done or a two and done of like, oh, I had the informational and I sent the thank you. Like, no, send them something
And I
after,
think
say something
our
back.
conversation when you came on our podcast, it really did remind me that I needed to do more of the follow up. And one of the things when I got my job, I let everybody know who I talked to. Like I sent
Wow.
personal emails and I was like, hey, like just want to let you know, like this is where I am. Thank you so much. Because a lot of times people are invested in your job search journey. Like even
Yes.
if they can't necessarily hire you, they want to know like how you're doing and if they can pass you on to someone else. So that was really cool.
Nice. Good. Okay. So let's talk about that inbound side, the podcast. So first, you guys decide to do a podcast. I will tell you the thing that has impressed me is you all took it so seriously from like, I know I met you very early on in the podcast and I was so
Yeah.
impressed of like, you took it so seriously. Cause I will be honest, like even with this channel in the beginning, when I didn't get a lot of views, it was hard to be like, and let me promote it on Instagram
Yeah.
and let me post it here. No one's going to see it. Who cares? Like I would tell everybody, no, the advice I would give to people if you want to start a YouTube channel is you have to treat it like 100,000 people are already watching. And
Yeah.
when I saw the way you all did your podcast, that's what I saw was like, and I don't know how many views you had. I'm not trying to pretend that you only had 10 people listening. I have no idea, but it was just very interesting to me that from the beginning, you all were doing Insta stories promoting, Instagrams promoting. From the outside, your podcast looked like it had thousands upon thousands watching from day one. And I know that when you're starting something, it's hard to take it that seriously.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how this is, I'm like, don't even know exactly how to word this question. How did you all decide to treat it that way? Is that just the work ethic of the two of you, or was that something you had to talk about? I'm curious about it.
Yeah, I think honestly, we both had nothing to lose. So we were both job seeking full time, like that's what we were doing. Both of us also were freelancing at the same time. So Annika is a freelancer as well. She has her clients, I had mine. But I think honestly, so I didn't set into a deep depression, I had to figure out something to do. I was like, I can't sit here and wait for someone to find me. Like I'm going to create avenues of, communication where I'm showing my work to other people. And also I had talked to so many people that were looking for jobs. And I think last year I had the opportunity to TA for an undergrad class. So I had a class, there was 150 students and I was directly responsible for about 30 of them. And I still talk to them and they were looking for jobs. And I was a grad student and they were coming out of undergrad trying to find jobs specifically in entertainment and not, knowing what to do.
It's dead. Yeah.
So I was like, you know what? Like I know some of these things. I've worked before. Like I know how to network. And I think too, because we were in a pandemic and starting one, I just really wanted people to know that they weren't alone. I think that was great for Annika, my co-host, and I. We have been on this journey together. So we've both, really been working together. Even before we started the podcast, we talked every day about our job journey. So I think that just was so unique in that, like, I had a person. So we just knew early on, like, okay, if we're going to create something, anything I put my name on has to be excellent. And I think I found somebody like with Annika, she's the same way. If I'm going to promote
both Enneagram 1.
Yes, we're both 1. And I think we just both knew it had to be excellent. So while we didn't prepare a ton, we did prepare in the sense that like we knew what we were putting out had to be good. And it's also funny because they're both extremely private people. So for us to like put something out there was like a huge deal. So I think our work ethic from the beginning was just the same. On days when I can't carry the load, she does. When she can't carry the load, I do. And like we've changed like things a little bit. Like we were on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn, all the things. And right now I'd say we primarily focus on LinkedIn and Instagram. That seems to be where our biggest audiences are. And we're learning our audience. Like we're dabbling in different things, like building our newsletter. But it's taken time to like know where our strengths are and like where our biggest audience is.
Nice. Yeah, I like what you said of it. First off, you had nothing to lose, but also it sounds like it gave you a project. It gave you a rhythm, something to have to show up for. And I think that's huge. Like as much as I talk about inbound networking for the sense of drawing people into you and getting to know you, I think especially when you're unemployed, when you're job seeking and you're unemployed, I have 2 videos about this too, y'all. Like there's a mindset, there's a how do we get out of bed every day? And I think having something you have to show up for and keep yourself accountable to does a lot, even if for some reason it didn't pay off in networking. But I am curious, like, did it bring connections for you? Did it bring, and how? Because I have ideas of how, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, I think for sure it brought connections. In that pretty much anybody we've brought on the podcast has really helped our career in some way. So I think very early on, we brought on a guest named Caroline Leach, and I had reached out to her for an informational interview, and she was like, "You're a writer. Why are you not writing more, like on LinkedIn?" And so I started like a mini blog series where every Wednesday I would start writing, and I would put a blog on LinkedIn. And so while she didn't have connections in the sense that like, she didn't have connections to hire me somewhere, she did help me like further along in my journey, because I wasn't doing a lot of the things that she had mentioned in like our call. And I think too, like doing a podcast, we had to create content, which means we had to be doing things. We had to be applying. We had to be changing our strategy. We had to be doing informational interviews. And all like my job offer came through networking. It like the position, like it was through networking. It wasn't through like a cold call application. So I think that was something that also like the podcast like forced me to do, is way more networking. And then by like most of the jobs I ended up applying for in the last month I was applying was because people had sent them to me, not because I was applying. I think around July, I stopped doing applications online. And if people were like, "Hey, I have this position," then I would apply, because it's honestly easier to get in if you have a connection.
Yes. Oh, you said the golden words. Because that's the thing. Everyone is applying to jobs and then finding the people who work there on LinkedIn. And it's like, if you would network, you will have people working for you. Like people will be working for you and finding jobs for you and just being like, "Hey, here's this thing you need to apply. Hey, you need to go do this." Like it takes so much pressure off you. You're not searching job descriptions all day long.
And people are still telling me, like, people who I network with are saying, "Hey, we have this job opening." And while I have my job and I'm very happy where I'm at, one of the cool things is now, like, I now know about all these jobs. So even I saw a girl who I didn't know, and she posted about, she'd been laid off from Disney, and she posted about it. And I think we were a second connection. And I said, "Hey, I just did a post on my LinkedIn about some jobs that are opening. If you're interested, let me know." And I knew the person who was posted the job, and she messaged me and she was like, "Hey, I applied. I'd love to be connected." And she got an interview.
That's awesome.
Because we connected people. So I'm like, you just have to be a little bit more out there and trust that people do want to help you.
Yeah. And I think, so you said the key word there, trust. It's a lot of trust that this very kind of murky way is going to pay off. Because I think applying online feels tangible. You can, at the end of the day, say, you can put 3 jobs in your job tracker, you know, and be like, "I did these, yay." And you can build on that. Whereas talking to 3 different people can feel like, cool, what did that do? But your proof, this is why I wanted you to come on, because it's proof that it does work. It does pay off.
Yeah. And everything like we tell people to do on the podcast, we tried. And we know if it either works or if it doesn't work because we tried it. And I think that was the cool thing about like informational interviews. Like I was very honest. I'm like, do not do this. I tried it and it failed. Like, do not ask people for a job right like out the gate. Like, introduce yourself, let them get to know you. And I put like on our website, I put like the things I said and what not to do, so people could see like if you're writing like this, don't do this, because it will kind of like hinder you from getting those answers.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, because the more it seems like you're using somebody, the more they're going to be like, I'm not going to share valuable info with you. Like, you're not going to come back around. But yeah,
exactly.
That's great. And y'all, in case at this point you're like, wait, what is this podcast? So once again, it's called Opportunity Unknown. Obviously, I will link all the info about it in the description box. Along with, I know in the earlier you mentioned the LinkedIn alumni tool, which is the best tool on LinkedIn. I do have a video of how to get there. So y'all, I'll link that below too. So you can go start using that tool. But Randa, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for doing this. I love it. Finally, you get to hear from somebody who's done it. As much as I think you should take my advice and I know what I'm talking about, I think it always helps to hear it from other sources and to hear it from someone who's in your shoes. So I'm glad Randa could be here today to help us and show you all networking can get you the job. It is possible.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Wasn't that good? Like, didn't that help you? I hope that motivates you, encourages you to get out there and start job searching. And if you want some help on this, if you want to learn how to do your own strategic job search, I have a free webinar right now. You can find the link to it in the box below, description box below. So that's it for today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.